Sure. I'm going to give the main introduction and then my personal introduction. Jenny Robb is the curator of the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum at The Ohio State University, where she presides over the world's largest collection of cartoon and comics materials. She received 2 master's degrees in history and museum studies from Syracuse University, then served as curator of the Cartoon Art Museum in San Francisco for 5 years before joining the Billy Ireland in 2005. Jenny Robb has curated numerous cartoon and comics exhibitions, including Exploring Calvin and Hobbes and The Long March, Civil Rights in Cartoons and Comics. But I don't know Jenny because of her job. I met Jenny on our first day of college, not knowing we would become good friends and housemates in the years to come. We actually had our first class at 8 a.m. the first Monday of college with chemistry. And it was super boring. And the professor talked like this the whole time. And if you asked a question, he would say, "That's a really dumb question." So needless to say, we were bonded for life after that. It was easy to like Jenny from the start. Jenny had an affable energy, one that welcomed in the world and people around her. She was back then and still is incredibly sharp. She is passionate about cartoons and what they reveal to us about our own lives and cultural truths. And she is a dedicated, thoughtful, and insightful leader. I get choked up at everything, so I apologize. I'm incredibly proud of her, but most of all, I'm lucky to call her my friend. Please welcome Jenny Robb, curator of the Billy Ireland.
Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you, all of you, for this opportunity to tell you about the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum and its very unique collection. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you all can see my slides. We'll see if this works. Okay, does everybody see my first screen, Secrets of the Museum?
Yes.
Yes, all right, excellent, thank you. So just to give you an overview, we're located on the campus of The Ohio State University, and we're part of the university library system. Now, in addition to a very comprehensive collection of books and journals and comic books, our holdings also include an extensive art collection of original cartoons, as well as an archive, and that includes the papers of cartoonists, as well as the archives of various professional cartoon organizations. And we also have an amazing collection of more than 2.5 million newspaper comic strip clippings and pages, which I will talk about later today. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scope of our collection. Basically, we're the premier center for the study, appreciation, and celebration of cartoons and comics. So you might wonder, when I'm talking about cartoons and comics, exactly what does that mean? So basically, it's newspaper comic strips, comic books, political or editorial cartoons, magazine cartoons like you would see in the New Yorker, as well as graphic novels, which is probably the area that's growing the most right now. And many of you may have already read graphic novels. Listening to the group talk today about giving out books to kids, right now the largest growing sector of the book market is graphic novels for young adults. So it's just become a really exploding thing. I'm not going to talk a lot about graphic novels today, but I did want to mention it here. So a lot of people wonder who Billy Ireland is. He's not a household name exactly. He was a cartoonist who worked for the Columbus Dispatch from 1898 until 1935. And he did both editorial or political cartoons, as well as a weekly feature called The Passing Show that commented on current events. And I picked this particular passing show from 1916 because of the title panel. And you can see there, Billy always had very unique and creative title panels. Every one was different. And this particular one, he has the letters of the passing show drawn as germs, grip germs. The grip was just another term for the flu at the time. And you can see a self-caricature of Billy. He called himself the janitor of the passing show on the right-hand side, and he's shooting a cannon of some pills into the germs from Fort Sneeze. So I thought that particular one would be of interest to us and the situation we're currently in. So we named ourselves the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum for 3 reasons. One, Billy was the mentor to our founding donor, cartoonist Milton Caniff. I don't know if any of you remember Milton, but he drew the comic strips Terry and the Pirates and then Steve Canyon. And it was his original gift that started the library back in 1977. Also, Billy Ireland was a beloved Columbus, Ohio cartoonist, so we wanted to honor him for that reason. And lastly, his descendants gave us our lead gift of $7 million for a new building project. We opened this new facility, which is pictured here, our museum is pictured there, in 1913. So today I'm going to show you some highlights of our collections and tell you the stories behind them. And the first item that I've chosen is one of our earliest American cartoons. Now, since politics and the election are at the top of everyone's minds, and there's a lot of talk about how divided and intensely partisan we are as a nation, and also how uncivil the conversation has become, I thought this one was particularly interesting. Now, it depicts an actual incident that happened on the floor of Congress in 1798. Back then, there were 2 parties, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. And this is the story behind this cartoon. The Jeffersonian Matthew Lyon insulted the Federalist Roger Griswold, who retaliated by calling Lyon a coward and taunting him about his military record. So Lyon responded by spitting directly in Griswold's face. Now, when Congress was unable to get a majority to expel Lyon for this behavior, Griswold avenged his damaged honor by coming in one morning and attacking Lyon with a cane right in the House chamber. So Griswold grabbed the fireplace tongs to protect himself, and the 2 proceeded to fight it out to the glee of some of their colleagues there, at least according to this cartoonist. So I think this is also a really good example of the fact that, before there was the internet or television or radio or anything like that, a lot of news was spread through cartoons, and cartoonists were able to comment in a satirical way on a particular incident or a person or a policy or something going on in the world. And this was a way that news could be spread to the public. Okay, so for my second one, in honor of Halloween, I picked an object in our collection with a scary ghost story behind it. So we've all heard of Jack the Ripper, but there's another Jack in the 19th century England who struck terror in people's hearts. And throughout the century, there were multiple reports, mostly from women, that a supernatural devil-like creature jumped out and attacked them while they were walking alone at night, sometimes clawing at their clothes or striking them. And the creature was eventually dubbed Spring-Heeled Jack because of his ability to leap high into the air, some said over houses. So Spring-Heeled Jack became the stuff of urban legend, and stories about him began to be told in popular culture. And this particular object is the first issue of a penny dreadful about Spring-Heeled Jack. Penny dreadfuls were cheap, sensationalized fiction that was all the rage in late 19th century England. And they often featured dramatic and gothic stories of detectives and criminals and the supernatural. They were very cheap, they were only a penny, so they were accessible to almost everyone. And this story is critical to the evolution of comics because it took the creature, Spring-Heeled Jack, in a different direction. He's not depicted as an evil villain. Instead, he's a costumed, altruistic vigilante, an avenger of wrongs, and a protector of innocent women. So this is really a precursor to pulp fiction characters and also to comic book superheroes like Batman. In fact, in this story, he's even described as having a bat-like body. But in this particular version, he's actually just a wronged nobleman who was tricked out of his inheritance by an evil cousin, and he's trying to right that wrong. So I chose this next one in honor of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which of course gave women the right to vote. Now this cartoon was published 4 decades before the suffragists were finally victorious, and it shows the challenges that they faced in their long battle. It was published in a popular humor magazine called Puck, and Puck and the cartoonist Kepler were generally really progressive in their politics. They fought against corruption and monopolies and usually sided with the oppressed and the downtrodden. But in 1880, they were definitely not on board with women's suffrage, as you can see. This cartoon depicts the horrifying and scandalous things that would surely happen if women could vote. So if you look closely at the central image, we have here lovely woman, having removed her political disabilities, her feminine clothing, is prepared to vote. And there's so many great little details in this cartoon. She's standing on a book that says female deportment and a paper that says modesty. You can see there's a cookbook overturned on the floor and ignored. She's reaching for a cigar, which was fairly scandalous for women at the time. And my favorite little detail here is that there's a tonic on the table and it says whiskers forced to grow. So implying that, if women were going to vote, they would start to dress like men and act like men, and they would even try to grow whiskers. Now, right above that, we see the political machine is superseding the sewing machine. On the left-hand side, we have an idyllic family scene that will be nevermore, nevermore. And on the right-hand side, we see what will actually happen. If women are given the vote, they will be out electioneering, and men will, of course, make a mess of the housework and the childcare. Now, if you look at the right-hand side here, you can see in the top panel, the ugly-looking man is driven from the polls, and in the bottom, a handsome fool gets the office. So here, implying that if women were given the right to vote, they would simply vote for the most attractive candidate. And then here on the left-hand side, we see that women would be treated like a male politician and has it chalked up like one. So this is women who are at a sample room, which I didn't know this until I started researching this cartoon, but that was what saloons or pubs were called in America at this time, sample rooms. And so this shows these women dressed as men would be in the saloon, and chalked up means they basically would be on credit for the whole week. And then on Saturday, it would be chalked up. And then on Saturday, they would have to pay off their debts. So obviously this cartoon is meant to be humorous, but it does reflect the attitudes and the beliefs of its creator, as well as its middle and upper class audience, which of course was largely male at the time. And I think, again, it's a good example here that cartoons, like all popular culture, do have the ability to influence how people think about issues and current events. So if you're looking at this cartoon, you can see why it took another 40 years for women to finally gain the right to vote. So I'm just curious, I can't see you all, but does anybody recognize this cartoonist?
Yes.
So this is Bill Watterson, the creator of one of the most popular and acclaimed comic strips of all time, Calvin and Hobbes. If you're not familiar with this strip, I highly recommend that you go out and buy the books and read it. It's absolutely fantastic. And we at the Billy Ireland are lucky to house the Bill Watterson collection, which includes almost all of the original art for the strip Calvin and Hobbes, as well as his early work. So before he came up with the idea for Calvin and Hobbes, he repeatedly submitted ideas for other strips to the major newspaper syndicates, and he was rejected over and over again. And we actually have a number of these rejection letters in the collection. But this one I like in particular because it has a very Calvin and Hobbes-esque quality to it. You've got these characters who are all animals, but they're looking up into the stars and philosophizing about life. But I want to show you a more typical, one of the typical Calvin and Hobbes. We've got the father here saying, "It's getting dark, Calvin. Time to come in and go to bed." "But Hobbes and I were catching fireflies. Can't we stay out a little longer?" "Ha! First you didn't want to go out, and now you don't want to come in. See, by not watching TV, you had more fun, and now you have memories of something real you did, not something fake you just watched." Calvin says, "Nothing spoils fun like finding out it builds character." So I love this strip, one, because my dad used to always tell us if there was something that we didn't want to do, that it would build character. But also because it really shows the conceit of the strip, which is that the tiger is a stuffed tiger to all the characters except for Calvin. And whenever it's Calvin and Hobbes together, he appears as a real tiger. And Bill Watterson famously wouldn't say whether that was just a figment of his imagination or whether Hobbes was really real. Also notice Calvin's spiky hair here. It's pretty iconic, and I want to show you another interesting thing in our collection, which is the original proposal for Calvin and Hobbes. So this is how he envisioned the characters originally. and what he sent to the syndicates. And you can see that Calvin's hair actually covers his eyes, his bangs there. And it was during the development process that an editor suggested that he might want to show the main character's eyes, because he would eventually want to be able to use that as a way to convey expression and emotion. And so Bill Watterson feels that's one of the best suggestions that he ever got from an editor. So this cartoon has some interesting parallels to recent events. Black voices were mostly shut out of the mainstream press in the 20th century, including, of course, Black cartoonists. So the Black press, which was owned and published by people of color for an audience of people of color, had its own cartoonists. And these are newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier. Now, we're very fortunate to have a great collection of the cartoonist Sam Millay, who worked for the Pittsburgh Courier. And this particular cartoon was drawn in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968. And the wave of unrest that spread throughout the country in the following week, and in some places actually turned violent. Now, the assassination was the spark, but people were also protesting inequality, systemic racism, and discrimination. Whoops, sorry about that. That King had fought against for his life. So obviously, the protesters were frustrated by the slow pace of change. Now, in this particular cartoon, Millay is actually critical of the extremists on both sides, both the white supremacists as well as Black rioters. But he's careful to point out that the resentment and hate led to the violence, and that was the cause. There was a cause. Bigotry and racism is the cause of the hate and resentment that the protesters experience. So without the white supremacy, you wouldn't have had the violent protests. So the Black press is a really interesting place to really, through cartoons, learn about the voice of people of color from the civil rights era. So this is a picture of Grace Drayton. She was called the Queen of Cute, and she was one of the very few women newspaper cartoonists in the early 20th century. This is one of her works. This is a comic strip called Dimples. This is an original, so you can see it's black and white. The color was added in the printing process. But I'm curious if anyone recognizes the characters from this comic strip, if they look like anything that you've seen before.
No.
Nope.
Maybe Shirley Temple?
Close. She does look very Shirley Temple-ish.
Have anything to do with Campbell's soup?
Oh, there it is.
Ah.
You got it.
Okay.
So she was the designer of the famous Campbell's Soup Kids. And you see here a 1913 postcard, as well as an advertisement in 1956. Of course, you know, even when I was growing up, we remember the Campbell's Soup Kids. They were redesigned a little bit, you know, throughout the time, but it's really incredible to see the longevity of these characters, and few people know who actually designed them. But Grace Drayton was a very independent woman. She actually had her own career as a cartoonist and an illustrator. She divorced twice in an era when that was a pretty scandalous thing to do. But she's really a fascinating woman. So I want to talk about one of the largest collections that we have received. This is the San Francisco Academy of Comic Art. And it was the life's work of this man, and his name is Bill Blackbeard, and that's his real name, the pirate Blackbeard. In the late 1960s, he wanted to write a history of the newspaper comic strip. But because he became concerned with the fact that libraries across the country were discarding their bound volumes of newspapers and replacing them with microfilm of the newspapers. So there were a number of problems with this, but one of the biggest problems for comics scholars is that the color Sunday funnies, which started in 1895, were photographed in this microfilm in black and white. So you can see here the difference between what the microfilm version looked like and what the actual original page looked like. So it really was would have been a tremendous loss in terms of our newspaper heritage had these not been preserved. The originals, as I mentioned, only a small fraction of which survived, by the way, because most people didn't really consider them art or worthy of preserving were black and white. So it was really, the color was added in the printing process. So the final version only existed as very fragile newsprint. So while while libraries were discarding all of these bound volumes, Bill Blackbeard launched into action. He formed his own nonprofit, the San Francisco Academy of Comic Art. He took his van and he went around to libraries around the country and started rescuing these bound volumes that libraries were throwing away. And he brought them back to this house in San Francisco. It's a huge house, but the whole first floor is a garage. And eventually, this is what that garage ended up looking like. As you can see here, it's just stacks and stacks, floor to ceiling, of newspapers, of bound volumes of newspapers. He stored these things in cardboard boxes, in filing cabinets, in crates, sometimes just stacking them floor to ceiling. And this was kind of a maze of aisles with just bare bulbs as the lighting. So he was something of a hoarder, but he was an organized hoarder. And you can see here, there he is in front of these stacks of newspapers. Whenever I see this picture, I think, oh my gosh, what a fire hazard. Luckily, it never did catch fire. And you can see here, the little white tabs are actually his filing system. So a tab might say, you know, here's where the Chicago Tribune Sunday sections start. And he knew where everything was. Unfortunately, he lost the lease on the house in 1997. And he contacted lots of institutions to see if they would rescue this material that, again, had been thrown out by libraries, but that he had saved for decades. And Ohio State University and the university libraries was able to step up, and we were able to transport the entire collection to Columbus. It took 6 semi-trucks, 6 of those huge moving trucks, to transport the collection, 2.5 million clippings and newspaper pages and sections. And that's just an estimate because we're not even sure exactly how many there are. So I just want to show you really quickly a couple of the gorgeous pages that were saved. And again, that might not exist if it hadn't been for Bill Blackbeard. So this is a Winsor McCay Little Nemo in Slumberland page. If you look at newspaper comics today, there's usually 6 to 8 Sunday strips all stuffed on a page. They're very small. But back in the early days, newspaper cartoonists had an entire page to work with, and they came up with absolutely gorgeous comic strips. This is a page by W.W. Denslow, who's mostly famous for being the original illustrator for The Wizard of Oz. And here we have a page by Lionel Feininger. This is called The Kinder Kids. And it's a quirky comic strip that featured the kids sailing around the world in the family bathtub. But Feininger also is interesting because he's best known as an expressionist painter and a leader of the famous Bauhaus School of Art. And he also has the distinction of being one of Hitler's degenerate artists. So it's interesting to see who was doing comic strips back in the early days. And then I picked this one. This is the same artist as my background here, Frank King, who did Gasoline Alley, which is a wonderful strip, one of the longest running comic strips of all time. But he's really known for his master storytelling, which he wedded with these beautiful images like this particular fall scene here. So here's an interesting bit of trivia. When you hear the word cartoon, you probably think of a humorous or a satirical drawing. You might think of an animated cartoon, Bugs Bunny, The Simpsons. But really up until 1843, the word had a different meaning. The word originally referred to a preliminary sketch for a mural or tapestry. And we can trace the modern definition of the word to this image in a British humor magazine called Punch. I mentioned Punch earlier to some folks that were on the call. Punch was the most successful and longest running of all comic weeklies. And in 1943, the Palace of Westminster was being rebuilt following a fire. So they commissioned preparatory sketches or cartoons for grand historical murals that they intended to paint in the new building. And then they exhibited these cartoons. So Punch decided to do a series of its own cartoons, and the first one was this one called Substance and Shadow, which criticized the government for spending money on art exhibits when people were actually starving. And ever since this, people started referring to satirical drawings as cartoons. So if you're familiar with this comic strip, this is Lynn Johnston's For Better For Worse. It debuted in 1978. And it was a mix of humor, but also longer stories that tackled some serious issues. And the characters aged in real time, which put Lynn in a bit of a tough spot because people started to point out to her that the family dog couldn't possibly live that long. So she decided to use it as an opportunity to deal with the difficult subject of losing a beloved pet. And she did it in something of a dramatic way. You can see here, the youngest daughter accidentally falls into the river. The parents don't realize that she's gone outside. And the dog, Farley, jumps in to save her. But it turns out that the stress is too much for him. He does save her, but his heart gives out and he passes away. You can see in the last panel there, the other daughter saying, "Daddy, he isn't breathing." So as the series unfolded, it took several weeks. Lynn started to just receive mountains of mail, many people begging her to let Farley live. And then when Farley died, she started receiving angry letters like this one. This author writes, "The front page of my newspaper is ripe with blood and gore. The television is worse. Where can I turn to for relief? The comic strips, maybe? I don't think so." Obviously, she's quite upset that Lynn Johnston would depict the death of a family pet in the comics. She goes on to say, "Comics are for escapism, Miss Johnson. They're not supposed to be a slap in the face with reality." So what's interesting, we have all of the letters and the cards that Lynn Johnston received this series, as well as the original art. After these sort of angry letters, she also received a number of sympathy cards, but they were written to the Patterson family as if they were a real family and as if Farley was a real dog. And then she started receiving letters thanking her for dealing with the loss of a pet, something that almost everybody has experienced at some point or another. And people appreciated the sensitive way that she dealt with it, and also told her the stories of their own beloved pets. So I think it's a fascinating example of how people bonded with comic strip characters who, came into their homes every day. People look forward to reading about them and almost came to feel like they were part of their own families. Now, this is my last one. We mostly focus on US comics and cartoons, but we do have international comics and cartoons as well in the collection. And in particular, we have a large collection of Japanese manga. Now, manga is just the word for comics in Japanese. And this is an example from a newspaper comics section called Jiji Manga, which was published in 1922. So take a second and look at the central image and see if you can figure out what is going on here. Now, when I first saw it, I wondered, why is this?
It's a telephone? Is it
Sorry,
a telephone?
go ahead.
It's a telephone. Or
It's a Zoom call.
A Zoom call.
Yes, yes. So the cartoonist is picturing a video call. So almost a century ago, he predicted that one day people in different locations would be able to talk to each other and see each other in real time, exactly as we are doing now. So what's humorous about this is that the man is in Paris, where he's assuring his wife in Japan between hiccups that he's really studying very hard in Paris. And the punchline at the end is that these modern conveniences are fantastic, except when they put people in a bind, like this poor guy who's caught partying when he's supposed to be studying hard.
I love it. Excellent.
So this is just a tiny sampling of the many different types of cartoons and comics we collect, and what I think are really fascinating stories behind them. I hope that some of you have the chance to visit our museum in person. We are open. We're open limited hours and by appointment only, but if you do make it to Columbus, I hope you'll have a chance to visit us. And now I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Oh, I should say this is our website if you want to check us out, cartoons.osu.edu.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jenny. That was excellent. Wonderful. If you all would raise your hands and I will recognize you if you have any questions of our speaker. Amarja, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, that was really good. I just want to know how you got interested in cartoons and yeah, just how your journey was.
Thank you for that question, because it turns out it actually involves Wittenberg University, which we were just talking about. This is a bit of a Wittenberg University reunion here. I was studying history and British Victorian history, and I got a grant to do an honors thesis to look at how British Victorian working class women were portrayed in popular images at the time, so popular culture. And this is long before the internet. I'm dating myself, but we didn't have all these resources available online. So I remember thinking, well, how am I going to find images of working class Victorian women to be able to do this research? And I went to Ohio State University, where they had a run of that magazine Punch that I showed that had the first cartoon. And I discovered in Punch that they had all kinds of amazing cartoons that featured working class women. And it just really struck me. One in particular, I'm sorry I don't have a slide of it, but it showed a woman and she's kind of facing the reader, and she has a black eye and she has a bandage over her other eye. And her friends are sitting kind of in the distance behind her, and they're saying, what's up with Sal? And the other one says, well, haven't you heard? She's married again. And that particular cartoon was fascinating to me. She's clearly a lower class woman, that it would be the punchline of a joke, that if you got married and you were a woman like that, you could expect to be beaten. And that was not something to be remedied or fixed. That was actually just sort of the punchline of this joke in this magazine. So that kind of cartoon made me really start to understand that cartoons are reflecting what the individual creator thinks and believes, but really also what's going on in society. And that they could be a really important resource. And not only historians, but many other scholars now use them to study, which is why the Billy Ireland is so important. Because if people aren't collecting that material and making it accessible and available, then people can't study it. Kevin?
I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. Certainly learned a lot today, and not the least of which was the one about Jack in 1886, with Jack Ripper himself beginning his crime spree in 1888. I couldn't help but wonder if the other Jack was kind of an inspiration for that Jack in 1888. All that aside, I just wanted to say I had an opportunity a few years ago to look at some cartoons. Your point about them reflecting the mood of the times is, I think, right in the money. I had an opportunity to look at some cartoons depicting immigration in the early part of the 20th century. And some of the cartoons depicting people from Ireland and people on the West Coast, people from Asia, particularly Japan and China, they're some of the most incredibly insensitive, heartbreaking, rude, crass things I've ever seen in my life. But they really do reveal the mood of the country at that time.
Yeah, in fact, we did an exhibition, I co-curated an exhibition on immigration cartoons, and we looked at a lot of those. One of the most famous political cartoonists of the 19th century, Thomas Nast.
Yes.
He, was mostly very progressive in his politics, but he had a real thing for Irish Catholics, and he portrayed them in the most vicious stereotypes. And in fact, a lot of people today, aren't, he's lost a lot of respect because of that. But many, many groups were portrayed in that way by cartoonists and others. Eastern Europeans, Southern Europeans, certainly African Americans. So if you're going to look at historical political cartoons, you're going to see very disturbing stereotypes. But it does tell us a lot about the attitudes of people, and I think it's hard to look at, but we need to see, if you were Irish American during that time and you saw yourself depicted in the mainstream publications in that way, how would that make you feel? What does that say to us about the challenges that those people faced?
Mhm.
So I think it's very important, but yes, certainly very disturbing when you see them. And you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, of course, was preceded by a number of very vicious cartoons published on the West Coast. Nast, who was pretty cruel to the Irish Americans, was actually very sympathetic to Chinese Americans. So it's very interesting to see, where to look at the cartoons to know where they were published, and then see what was going on in that particular area. On the West Coast, of course, is where most of the Chinese were coming in. So thank you. That's a really interesting topic.
Excellent. Kelly, you have a question if you would unmute yourself.
Hi, Jenny. Thanks for your presentation. So because Promising Pages takes donated books, I imagine that you get a lot of phone calls about, accepting someone's collection or they want to donate things. What do you do with the things that you can't use? And then what's kind of your criteria as to what you do bring in and either store or then display?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we do get a lot of people contacting us who have large book collections or large comic book collections that they're interested in donating. So our goal is to collect one of everything in terms of printed material. But we don't keep duplicates for the most part, unless there's a special reason for it, like it has it's signed or it has a drawing in it. So with the duplicates, what we do is we have a book sale. Well, I should say we used to have a book sale back in the day when you could have a bunch of people come and handle stuff. We would have a book sale of our duplicates, which then the proceeds from that would support the work that we're doing. And in some cases, we have also transferred books to other institutions. So in the 70s, when we started, there were very few academic libraries, very few public libraries that were even willing to collect anything that looked like comics. It just wasn't considered, good enough for libraries and universities and museums. That has changed a lot, and the attitudes are very different. So now we're seeing a lot of libraries with intentionally collecting cartoons and comics materials. And so sometimes when we have duplicates, we transfer them to other institutions.
Thank you.
Excellent. Do we have any? Jenny has a question. Jenny, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Jenny. The collection of all those newspapers that were in the garage, how did he keep them from deteriorating? And what are you guys doing to keep them from deteriorating?
That is a great question. So the fact that they were in San Francisco was lucky, because San Francisco it doesn't have extremes of temperature really, and it has a pretty consistent humidity. And even though it was not kept in a climate control area, most of it was in pretty good shape, which is pretty surprising, because it was, again, kept in this kind of garage-like place for 40 years, almost 40 years. So there was some material that had been damaged through water and had to be destroyed, unfortunately, but about 98% of it was in good shape. We are in the process of rehousing all of it in acid-free Mylar and acid-free boxes and folders. It's such a massive job that we've had the collection for 20 years. We got a Getty grant early on to start the process. We finished about 25% of this collection, and we have been slowly, trying to get more done as we go. But we just got a grant from the Hearst Foundation for $200,000, and our goal is to get everything rehoused and cataloged. Unfortunately, we got the grant in December of last year, and just when we were about ready to hire someone for the position, the pandemic hit, and we now have a freeze on hiring. But we're hoping to get back on track, because the material really is not duplicated anywhere. Libraries really did destroy all of this stuff, and so in some cases we have very rare materials that otherwise would not exist. So my goal now is to be sure that we get it all rehoused and appropriately preserved.
Thank you.
Excellent. Romi's got a question. Romy, please unmute yourself.
Jenny, So you said that you talked about the importance of the Billie Ireland Museum and this work in the United States. Are there parallel museums or similar museums, as concerned about caring for their collections in other parts of the world that you would consider like a sister kind of institution?
Yes, there's a couple. There is a huge museum in Kyoto in Japan, the International Manga Museum. We have a partnership with them. In fact, they sent us their duplicate manga magazines, and that's a huge collection of manga that we have. It's not available anywhere else in the United States. There's also a sister institution in Angoulême, France. So in France, comics is called bande dessinée, and it's quite popular. It's considered the 9th art. And so they have a whole museum that's entirely funded by the government, which is interesting, that is dedicated to bande dessinée. And so we partner a lot with them. There's a museum in Belgium as well. There's a collection at the University of Kent at Canterbury of comics and cartoon art. And we're starting to see more and more spring up in different countries. In fact, I just learned that the New Zealand National Library now has a special comics collection, and they have an advisory board of cartoonists. And I'm going to hopefully be speaking to them via Zoom sometime soon. So yes, we're seeing a lot of international interest in comics and cartoons, political cartoons, comic strips. But as I said, graphic novels are where things are really exploding, and particularly memoir, people telling their story through comics. And one of the areas is graphic medicine. So if you look up graphic medicine, you'll see that lots of people are telling stories about their illness, diseases, their experiences with the healthcare system through comics. And it's really a fascinating thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we will go ahead and make this the last question. So if anyone has one last question, okay, Kelly, we get the last question, and then I'm sure Jenny will be happy to stay online for a few more minutes to chat with those people who don't want the pressure of asking questions in front of a large group. So
right,
let's
Jenny.
get the last.
Here it is. So if you get any, graphic novels obviously are huge in our world, and students as young as first grade are asking for graphic novels, which there aren't a lot of for that age group, but we're seeing more. But historical fiction is starting to really blow up in our elementary school worlds, and they've started making some really fantastic historical fiction graphic novels. So what I would ask is, if you get any that you'd like to trade with us, please contact me. I'm happy to send you my information. Anything you'd like to donate to a 501c3, we'll take it. We'll be happy to take it off your hands if you have a duplicate.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Yes, I'll get your contact information, because as I said, in the past, we've been able to have a book sale to sell these things, and we're not able to do that now. So it is very different. But if anybody has kids or grandkids or in their lives, definitely consider graphic novels. There's some amazing series. There's a series that started with Smile by Raina Telgemeier. That's kind of an autobiographical series that kids absolutely love, girls and boys. But there's also adventure stories like the graphic novel Bone, which is quite popular and was done by somebody from Columbus, Ohio, which is one of the reasons I mention it. But if you look at Scholastic, great gift ideas. And if you want to purchase some books to give to Kelly and Eric, you should absolutely do that.
Oh, they know, believe me. But we also get amazing things like this huge Calvin and Hobbes.
The complete set. Calvin and Hobbes.
Oh my gosh, I just see that now. That's fantastic.
You can always trade if you need anything.
Well, I'll tell you that my son, who's 8, has just gotten into Calvin and Hobbes. And when we put him to bed, we think he's gone to sleep, and we'll go in 15 minutes later, and he's got this little headlamp, and he's sitting there reading Calvin and Hobbes. So it's just wonderful to see kids. And comics can really be a way to kind of a gateway to prose reading. It really is an important educational tool, especially for reluctant readers, but really readers of all ages. I think there's something for everybody.
The context is typically harder than people think, like the words, the vocabulary, it's much deeper. And so people shouldn't poo-poo it, no judging.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you so much, Jenny. A round of applause for our wonderful speaker. Thank you so much for being with us. That was a delightful presentation. Thank you, Shuli, for your part in helping getting Jenny out here today. Appreciate you. Appreciate President Preston McKee joining us from Johnson City Rotary Club. And thank you for all our guests and visitors. Great to have you with us today. A wonderful program as always. And now we will move forward with our Rotary four-way test of the things we think, say, or do. First,
Is it the
is
truth?
it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And finally, fifth, will it be fun? Excellent. Thank you all. The meeting is adjourned, but please stay online. We'll keep the lines open for another 10-15 minutes to allow you to ask any individual questions you may have. Again, thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jenny. That was fantastic.
Jenny, one quick question that I didn't want to ask during the meeting. Do you know, because I'm very interested in old ads, are there any museums that you're aware of that have collections of ads from the 20s and 30s? I'm fascinated by those, but just curious if you're aware of any museums that curate those.
That is a great question. I'm not aware of any that focus specifically on advertisements. I think there's one in England that focuses on like packaging.
Okay.
But I will say, I didn't mention this, but in addition to the cartoons that I looked at in Punch when I was researching how women were portrayed, I also found a lot of advertisements. And so that was actually a whole section of my paper. So I'm with you. I think those old advertisements are really fascinating and
They really
tell us a lot, again, about the culture and the society.
Absolutely.
If there's not a museum, there should be one.
There should be. I agree. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This was fascinating.
Thanks for your questions.
Jenny, I have a question about the graphic novels. I am a big Stephen King fan. And I know Walking Dead was a huge graphic novel before the TV show. Do you guys collect those types of things also?
Absolutely. Our focus, so we're in a consortium with another university that is focused on collecting actual comic books. So like the typical comic books that you think of.
Archie.
And so we have about 40,000 comic books. They have like 200,000. But what we do is we collect them once they're bound and they're in longer stories. We would collect that. And we also collect, of course, original art. So we might have original art from series like The Walking Dead, and as well as the papers of cartoonists. The other library, which is actually at Michigan State, they don't collect original art or the papers. So we kind of tried to divide things up a little bit so that we're not, because there's so much out there when you're talking about cartoons and comics, no institution can do it all.
Yeah.
So we did try to kind of divide it up a little bit, but now there are more and more universities that are collecting that kind of material. But you'd be amazed, obviously the superhero movies, but so many movies and TV shows were originally graphic novels or comic books. And well, a lot of people don't even realize sometimes that was the source material.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Jenny, I've got something here. I don't know whether it can be seen.
Yeah, we can see it.
Can you see it okay? This is a June 3rd, 1935 cover of Punch magazine.
Aha!
And the caption, obviously, there's a guy sitting with his girlfriend on the riverbank.
Yep.
And he's busy fishing. She's got other things in mind. But the caption on it says, "Frederick, can't we find some place where there are fewer fish?" And this was a gift that my wife Lori gave me on our honeymoon when we were in Stratford upon Avon.